G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day, and it's a Friday, at least here in Australia, and wherever you are, at least you're heading into it. I hope you're gearing up for a fantastic weekend. Now, as per the title of this, I haven't come up with the title yet, but we will talk about Zelensky's comments about a new peace conference and what may then come of that. We need to look at sort of some military theory that surrounds this as well, as also, I guess, the reality and what could happen and what, of course, he has said. Now, we talked a little bit about the energy crisis that is not only ongoing in Ukraine, but also will continue to get worse into the winter, and how can the EU help that? How can this be helped? How is Russia continuing to strike this? The ICC, of course, is involved in warrants against those who are then signing off on those bombings, but we need to look at something that may not be as published as well about some other issues directly contributing to this. Of course, we'll look at the maps. Ukraine has launched a couple of offensives as well and taken back some ground. So we will talk at that. And of course, we'll look at some footage, and we'll also look at some propaganda pieces as well. But I'm guessing the title on this is something like, "Is it all over?" Now, this clip of Zelensky has been going viral today. Now, instead of watching this, I'm going to read out what exactly has been said and what exactly could then happen due to this. So, a detailed action plan should be prepared to consider at Ukraine's second peace summit over the next few months. This peace summit will be at the end of 2024. We're halfway. We're nearing the end of the year. I know, I can't believe it. Also, develop a new joint peace plan based on Zelensky's 10-point peace proposal. We know number 5 and 6 is Ukraine's sovereignty, then the borders. Number 1 is their nuclear security. But at the moment, Russia occupy a portion of Ukraine, and this 10-point peace plan starting there is going to be difficult for Russia to come to the table looking at what is happening and then on the ground. Now, what Zelensky has said here, I actually just want to bring up my next slide because I have exactly what he has said. Now we need to develop a detailed plan, detailed steps regarding all the crises that Putin's war has brought to our countries. We have months to come up with this plan. We don't have much time. We have many wounded, killed, both military and civilians. So we don't want this war to last for years. Therefore, we should prepare this plan and put it on the negotiating table at the second peace summit. So there will be some plan prepared, put forward at the second peace summit coming in the next few months, but that we don't have much time due to the amount of casualties, both killed and wounded, military and civilians, that Ukraine has incurred over this war. We'll continue here. Now, some countries participated were notably absent from signatories such as India, Saudi, Indonesia, Colombia, South Africa. This is for then that peace summit. Of course, China refused to be in Russia's absence. Russia was not invited. What the big telling point of this peace summit was, and what I believe Ukraine was mainly trying to do, was unite and try and get the global south onto Ukraine's side of support. They have a lot of influence over Russia. Russia has a lot of influence economically, politically, and militarily in areas in the global south too, especially then China has as much, or if not more, as well. We're going to talk more about the global south, but what I want to speak on is the reality of this. Like Zelensky says here, we don't have much time. We don't want the war to last for years. Now, if this is going to be something of peace at the end of this year, we don't want it to go on for years, I think that could actually be detrimental to what Ukraine's tactic should or may actually be, as well as it's going to have to take into account, as Putin has said here, it must be based on reality. The reality on the ground now is, why would Putin withdraw from these territories, not militarily? What, at the end of the day, negotiation means negotiation, and at this point in time, why would Putin withdraw from these? It needs to be, like, if we're doing this and it needs to be by the end of the year or whatever, that is something that people have to take into consideration and ask yourself this: why right now would Putin withdraw from these areas, of which in most fronts they currently hold the initiative? They have the shells and the men as well in overmatch, at least numerically. So that's the question to be asked, and that needs to be based in what comes of these. And that's why people say if it's based on the 10-point peace plan, it falls over at number 5 and 6. Why would Russia continue on the table. But Zelensky also says in this, there's something I want to touch on before we talk of the Global South, we don't want this war to last for years. Now, this is, in my eyes, exactly how Ukraine could actually be victorious or win this war. I don't think, right now, I'll say I don't think militarily there's going to be any massive victory for a long time. And any victories here, whether it's Russia pushing to Kharkiv or if Ukraine pushes to Melitopol, Mariupol, Sevastopol, I think the military cost that would incur with the defensive works both sides have could be absolutely a Pyrrhic victory. But regardless, I think time is what Ukraine need to play into. Look at, and we're going to talk about some military theory here. This is exactly how, say, the Afghanis won over both the Soviets and the coalition. It is your home. You can wait them out. What you're trying to do is make this war so expensive that the other side can't maintain the funding or public support. And this should maybe have always been the plan. Do you think that the T-Man in Afghan beat the SAS in a single gun battle? No. Did they outlast them? Yes. My favourite quote from a member of the T-Man was, "You have the watches, but we have the time." And again, throughout military history, this has shown to work against the larger power, because the larger power has so much more logistics to then have. And by the end of the year, Ukraine is not going to be in the place for a new counter-offensive, especially with strikes on Russia's energy grids, that I believe this could be then a waiting game. So let's talk about some of the military theory that then backs this up. We're going to be talking about von Clausewitz and as well Sebastian Junger, a couple of books you should read. So he says, the state of pure resistance affords superiority in the contest, and if this advantage is sufficient to balance whatever superiority in numbers the adversary may have, so Russia has superiority in numbers, then the mere duration of the contest will suffice gradually to bring the loss of force on the part of the adversary to a point which the political object can no longer be an equivalent. At point, therefore, he must give up the contest. We see that in the class of means wearing out the enemy includes the great number of cases in which the weaker resists the stronger. Now, this was written a long time ago, but there's even more examples that prove this since then, and even potentially better ones. Now, if we want to overcome the enemy by duration of the contest, we must content ourselves with as small objects as possible. For it is in the nature of the thing that a great end requires a greater expenditure of force than a small one. So the greater, more expenditure of force trying to wear that out. This is why in military theory and attritional war doctrine, why I've said with like offensives, Ukrainian offensives into areas, this in my mind doesn't fit what Ukraine has been in some areas and hasn't been in other areas on the front line. Now, this negative intention, which constitutes the principle of the fewer defensive, is also the natural means of overcoming the enemy by the duration of combat. That is, of wearing him out. We'll talk a little bit more. Now, the pure defensive positive object is wanting, and therefore, while in the defensive, our forces cannot at the same time be directed on other objects. They can only be employed to defeat the intentions of the enemy. We have to consider the opposite of the destruction of one's enemy's armed force, that is to say, the preservation of our own. So you're preserving your own forces in the destruction of the enemy's, the lengthening of the war. Junger talks about this as well. Conventional armies burn through more fuel, munitions and food the same way large fighters burn through more oxygen. Even wealthy nations can't afford to maintain that level of effort indefinitely. The logistical demands of modern mechanised army are so enormous, its resources are going to simply supplying itself. Air power also has limited value against smaller forces, dug-in forces, and we will talk about the maybe guerrilla-style militia warfare that may take place further down the line. But like we said, at the end of the year, Ukraine, from what we're seeing, is not going to be ready to go on the offensive. So the reality on the ground, if there is a peace negotiations take place, it's going to have to take into account Russia's successes over this year, as well as where both countries are sitting, and that Russia has not had these collapses of what many bloggers and experts had also then predicted. And I believe that John Mersheimer may have been correct when he quotes officials saying that the high water line for Ukraine was actually the end of 2022. too. So there's a few things we need to take into account here and a few things that concern me. So if a peace deal is signed and Ukraine do officially sacrifice some land, from a talk I've had very recently, there would be celebration and relief for a few months, but he thinks after this, there may be a lot of resentment from soldiers towards the government and officials after their promises and mistakes were made, the losses they took, and then losing that ground. But we may also see the millions of Ukrainian refugees who have fled Ukraine may then not return, at least not return en masse, because in a lot of the studies you see that it's reliant on Ukraine achieving its initial goals at 1991 border. But Russia's going to have ongoing issues too. They've also had huge losses, huge expenditure. Their initial goals have failed, at least depending where this lies. And occupying territory, like in the doctrine, the theory we've just spoken about, is historically very, very difficult. And they will have to contend with potential militia groups uprising and existing in these areas of occupation. That said, this is the exact reason, but in reverse, I believe that Donetsk and Sevastopol and other areas may be hellish for Ukraine as well. When you've got a population that may not be friendly to you, uprisings, resistance, guerrilla, militia groups can be incredibly deadly for a large force too. Can be very hard to actually get that under control. But the main difficulty, the main failure of the last peace summit was to get the global south on board. And we can look at this map and see, of course, the countries that participated and signed. Well, these are all ones of which we basically expected. And you can see countries that participated and didn't sign, such as then India. Now let's have a look and we talk about the global south. What actually is then the global south? So we can see if we line then, how do I move this? If we line then these two maps up, that it did fail to get the majority at all of the global south on board with Ukraine's final communique. Now, I know there's been a few countries trickle into this after, but still to get the global south as a whole definitely hasn't worked. Now, why may this not have worked? Well, I believe Israel, Gaza had a hell of a lot to do with this. Now, we're going to look at both something from Rusi and Al Jazeera. I know Al Jazeera is very, very biased towards it, but they can give an idea of what people may be feeling. It's not entirely Ukraine's fault. They failed to secure the support of the Global South for its war aims at the summit. The global majority's cold shouldering of the summit reflects an ongoing decline of America's global influence, which accelerated significantly in the past 8 months in the light of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza and President Biden's continued backing of Israel in the face of it. Whether Kyiv likes it or not, anyone who is seen as America's client state is going to be approached with a great deal of skepsis. And this is what we spoke about as well, even with the ICC. If America won't back the ICC against one of its allies, why should other countries back the ICC against one of America's then enemies? I know people are pointing out, oh, this is whataboutism. Regardless, if many, many people, billions of people, and powerful governments and rising governments may see it this way, it's something we need to take into account. Now, the disparity in resourcing and attention paid to Ukraine or Gaza as compared to Tigray, for instance, has left a strong and bitter sense across Africa as to the hierarchy of Western concerns. And we can apply this, I think, to the global south. Similarly, the apparent contrast of Western language and rhetoric between how it described the destruction of Aleppo or Mariupol and how it's excused Israeli operations in Gaza leave many on the continent perceiving a gap between Western rhetoric about values and values practiced by those who have for so long imposed constraints on the policies of African states to enforce value-based norms. In this context, Russia is exploiting a rich opportunity to build new relationships and in doing so, set up challenges for the West. So that is just an outlay of the problems that I see, why the first one had so many issues and why the second one is going to be really difficult, and it's going to have to take into the realities of what is happening on the ground. And if it is going to be, like as Zelensky said, we don't want it to go on for years, I think that can affect Ukraine's tactic, because I think Ukraine's best tactic is to remain pulling back, wearing out Russia, as well then as implying that cost massively on Russia and trying to burn themselves out rather than a pure tactical military push through. The Russian economy, industry, military has been far more resilient to losses and far less susceptible to sanctions than initially had thought. And that needs to come into all accounts of this. Now, we spoke in the beginning that Ukraine is getting closer to EU membership as well. Problems in energy. We know Ukraine is way down on its energy, and currently what is being imported from the EU is not going to backfill that. Even in summer, people have power for 4 to 6 hours, and the state energy providers have said into winter, this is going to get much worse. I see people already online saying that we can't even use our fridges. But we need to talk at, because this is exacerbated massively, of course, it is caused by Russian strikes, but can be exacerbated by corruption and some other issues. And some people maybe should relinquish some control. So we need to look at this. This only came out then yesterday, of the 27th, that law enforcement agents were charged with former department head of Ukrenergo, Ukraine's state owned energy provider, for embezzling funds designated for bulletproof vests. The vests are intended to be used by the employees of Ukrenergo. We know these employees have suffered then casualties. They were buying them basically at double the market cost, to about $250,000. And of course, this doesn't help the energy provider. It doesn't help morale. And if it's happening for bulletproof vests, well, I'd like to have a look through the rest then, because if you're willing to do it to bulletproof vests of your employees, trust me, you're willing to do it in many other aspects. But as well, I talked about this a while back, but DTEK is Ukraine's largest private energy company, but that no one will finance it because of the owner is an oligarch, Rinat Akhmetov. The international finance institution, like the European Bank of Reconstruction, the International Finance Corporation, and the DFC have a policy not to finance DTEK over its ownership. That the bank's office said, we're very selective about whom it works with in Ukraine, and that's it. It does not work with oligarchs. Now, this guy's probably a bloody billionaire. Maybe you should let up some of your ownership so it can actually be funded to help your countrymen as well. So that's just things exacerbating already a huge problem caused by strikes. Now, Zelensky had this as well in the past few days. Ukraine has started actual negotiations on EU membership. We know this is one of the goals Ukraine has, is to enter the EU and NATO. Something I think people look over is this may be a lot further away than some people think. Maybe it may be closer, but I believe it's still going to be. Ukraine has a lot of things it needs to sort out before this. First and foremost, the war. But we have seen in the leaked peace negotiation deals, say in early in the 2022 war, or the initial invasion, that Russia didn't have a problem with Ukraine joining the EU, but of course they did with NATO. Now we continue here. Zelensky says Russia's recent offensive shows pressure on Kremlin that it's not enough. Thanks to the bravery of people and decisions of you, our partners, we stopped the Russian offensive. But this new Russian offensive proved the existing pressure on Russia for the war is not enough. The fulfillment of every promise is important, not only in terms of protecting lives, but to destroy the Russian illusion that they will achieve something by war. So saying that the pressure from Europe and the promises of weapons that some have not delivered is currently not enough, that Putin is still trying to, quote, expand the war. Now, Ukrainian president met with the 27 leaders of the EU in Brussels. We know this is going on currently and today, and this is 2 days after his country began former membership talks. Provide Ukraine with extensive support regardless of any institutional changes. So, of course, this will take, like we said, a long time. What they want is promises, regardless of what changes in governments within the EU, that Ukraine will still have then these promises and agreements upheld. Zelensky has told the AFP that France would continue to support Ukraine regardless of the political situation. As we know, the RN has then getting more power in France too. But we need to look at what is exactly said. The French National Rally will not allow Russia to absorb Ukraine. I will not let Russian imperialism absorb an allied state like Ukraine. Support for Ukraine and avoiding an escalation with Russia. So we know pledging support, but they also have talked about they don't want these long-range weapons to then fuel the war further. So let's look at a few bits of footage too. We have, I've heard different locations where this is, but just for sake of footage, let's have a look. This is a Ukrainian then MiG-29 firing off two then 240 Hammer missiles. These were said to be fired into the Belgorod Oblast, so across the border into Russia, but again, not 100% sure exactly on this. I haven't seen like a good geolocation. I've seen a few different ones, but you can see then that MiG-29 then turning back there. So I think the MiG-29 is like historically the most beautiful fighter aircraft ever. Russia have released this bit of like propaganda footage too of workmen then changing over the sign of Avdiivka from Ukrainian into then Russian here, as well as then the military hardware. So you can see in the back signs of areas of which Russia has taken, and then you can see signs, and then the military forces then continuing to move forward with then planes and helicopters. So reinforcing the idea that these are Russian towns and the link between the military and civilian workers in that area. That's the goal of something like this. Now, before we look at the maps, I need to talk about this Patriot system. Now, this was from Financial Times. The US and Israel and Ukraine are in talks to supply Kyiv with up to 8 Patriot air defense systems. We're not talking 8 batteries, we're talking systems. While finalised, the arrangement would likely involve the highly prized Patriot system being sent from Israel to the US before being delivered to Ukraine. Israel said in April that it will begin retiring its 8 Patriot batteries, which date back more than 30 years, and replacing them with more advanced systems. But the batteries have been used in Israel's current war with H1 and have not yet been discontinued due to concerns that tensions with Iranian-backed H2 militant group could erupt into full-blown war. So I personally, looking at the massive boiling point that is currently happening in the north of Israel, South Lebanon, I can't see any of these being retired yet. I think, and we've spoken about the shortage of Patriot missiles could become more and more prevalent due to if that kicks off even more. And then, of course, we may see Iran be more involved. So I wouldn't hold my breath on maybe those promises of sale. Now, let's have a look at the maps. Here's Ukraine, the center. Here's the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupies its 22, purple since 2014. Now, there's very few changes on this map, but something I missed yesterday, which I've seen today, is this. So, of course, we're up in the north. This is Vovchansk-Lipsy front, but then we see just up here, there must have been some level of crossing. I didn't see any footage of this come out, but on the 27th, we see some grey zone push up, and then the 28th, the grey zone push back. So was there some Russian advancement over the border there, then a pushback like we saw up in the Sumy Oblast a few weeks ago, maybe just a operation across the border and back. We've seen a little bit of that over both ways across the border, but let's have a look at then some areas. So let's start up in the north. We'll come into then Vovchansk. Now, this map not showing any changes in here, although we know Ukrainian operations are going on in the center of Vovchansk. And we have then a Wallmapper update here today. I will say Wallmapper is very conservative with any gains, but he doesn't show any of then this disconnect. It's also not the easiest to see, but we'll get a good idea of this. So this is this reservoir. This is the Vovcha River running through here. And you can see both the grey zone, Ukrainian controlled, and then Russian controlled here, showing that Ukraine is controlling ground in the middle here. So maybe there should be blue on this map of where Ukraine has pushed across the Vovcha and operating in here, but also doesn't show this disconnect. We spoke about this disconnect then yesterday and said, look, it's been a couple of weeks. If you had 400 guys disconnected like this, that's not lasting that long at all. Now, let's push across just a little bit, look at some of these said gains of Ukraine. Now, of course, these aren't being shown on this map, and some of them are being shown on Surak, but others are then not. So let's talk about Sinkivka. So we saw just to the east of here, we did see this gain by Russia over the last couple of days. We see that increase in grey zone, and it was confirmed through some other maps. So let's just have a look here. Now, this is saying basically in this same area that Ukraine has then had a push back. So let's just line this up the best we can. So we see then this road, we can see this reservoir and this reservoir here that Ukraine has pushed into these areas. Now, by this map, this doesn't show that Russia was in these areas. So it's hard to get an idea of what's happening. This is, say, the tree line down in here. So we know Ukraine has had an operation here, maybe clearing back this grey zone, but we're not exactly sure what has occurred in there itself. But we will push down the line a little bit. Now, nothing around better stove front. Then we come down and we see then, I'll call this the tourney. We did see yesterday that Ukraine made a major advancement here, pushing then back the Russians. And this is lined up through a couple of maps. So then Noel Reports has this map showing in the same general direction and same advancement, as well as then Suryak show this as well. And by 3 of these maps, showing it. We will confirm it here. Situation north of Donetsk. During the last days, Ukrainian army managed to recapture numerous positions east of Terny. And I don't think these maps are showing much too different in here. So showing there was a Ukrainian advancement in the Terny front here too. Now we just need to come down a little bit. Now there is some geolocated footage I won't show you, but it's just right in here in Bilohorivka, but it is in grey zone. But we do know that some maps are showing far more red controlled Russian area around here than this map is showing. We'll come down Bakhmut front, then Chasiv Yar. Now here is some interesting things. No change shown on this map, but Noel reports is showing that in this area that Ukraine has made a push back in. Now, on the western side of this shows this only to have been grey zone, but into then where this road up to here, just beyond, shows that Ukraine has had an advancement back in on this sort of L-boot shaped part here that Ukraine is pushing back. But at the same time, I'm seeing reports through Telegram and Twitter from Russian accounts saying that Russia is actually having a slight withdrawal from here due to how heavily barricaded and the bunkers and basements here, and choosing to shell it further to then push through with land troops again. And then we get footage released today of many thermobaric weapons landing then in Chasiv Yar against buildings in here, as we can see. So again, this is what the Russian accounts are saying, that yes, there's been a slight withdrawal, trying to flatten this, soften it up again before ground forces push back in. Now, whether that is true or not in this area, I won't go into that, but we have seen from the guys I've been interviewing and talking to, one of the things they're having problems with is Russian troops, some of the better troops, have actually more initiative on the ground and are able to make the decision themselves to pull out of areas to then call in more artillery if they believe that's not going to be successful. And they were saying, the Ukrainian guys telling me this, that has been one of the biggest changes they've seen on the front and something that Russia's been having success with there as well. So massive thermobaric attacks there. Thermobarics particularly are deadly against basements, built up fortifications, for how then they work. Now, New York front, haven't seen much change in here. We saw this open up. We thought this could be something, but it has seemingly stalled in here. But we have seen then a Syriac map update in here today. So this is just pushing down. If we have a look where then the train line runs up here towards, this is New York, that it's saying that Russia had an advancement in here. Now these again aren't easy to see, but we'll see where it slightly turns out, or it turns back, that it's saying basically up to the grey zone in here that Russia has had an advancement. New York, after several days of fighting, the troops managed to take the first trenches and houses in the town. New access has been opened towards Donetsk agglomeration. So this will be interesting to see, because we're seeing that, we're hearing that Russia is pushing on this axis and then this axis in here. So we did see then the 24th to the 25th, we then see a grey zone increase here. So definitely being confirmed by Ukraine that there is some level of extra control in here, or grey zone, or out of control. So interesting to see what's happening there. But as well as other areas, we get no further changes. The second day in a row, we haven't seen on this map any Russian advances anywhere on this. Anyway, legends, have a fantastic day. Hope you enjoyed it. Sorry if the first bit was very wordy, but have a great weekend, and I'll speak to you tomorrow. Thank you. Bye-bye.